welcome. Today we are going to learn how to sew some Christmas stockings. And we're not just going to sew it one way or two ways or three ways. We're going to do 4 different versions for this particular stocking. I have a free pattern linked in the description down below. You will end up piecing 4 pieces of paper together to create this pattern. If you've never done anything like that before, in the description down below, I have a tutorial that walks you through how to piece together and how to print these printable patterns. Now, as far as what stockings we are actually going to make, let me show you. So the very first tutorial I'm going to walk you through in this video is how you can piece together this simple stocking. This Christmas stocking does have a lining and it does have a really nice cuff. It's all made out of cotton fabrics. You don't have to do any interfacing, anything like that. It's a very basic, very simple stocking that I think turns out really nicely. But we can level up this stocking in so many different ways. And I'm going to have timestamps in the description down below that you can click on to send you to the version that you want to learn about. But let me show you what those versions are. This method is the quilt as you go method. And the nice thing about the quilt as you go method is that you don't have to worry about needing quilting pins and all of those extra quilting supplies to do this method. And you can still have a lot of fun making different designs. And this is a patchwork version. It does do your normal quilting method. So you'll learn some quilting techniques as you go making this one. And then at the very end, I'm going to walk you through everything you need to know to be able to add a nice fuzzy cuff to your stocking. Adding the fuzzy cuff is different than adding your normal cuff. So I hope that all makes sense. We are going to jump right on in to sewing our basic stocking first. And then after that, I'm going to show you a few alternatives. Let's get sewing. Cut 2 pieces of fabric 12 inches high by 9 inches wide. That will be your cuff. And then another piece of fabric 2 inches high by 6 inches wide. That will be your loop. And then you will take your pattern piece and you will lay it onto 2 pieces of fabric mirroring each other. So you will cut 2 of your pattern piece out for your outer fabrics and 2 from your lining fabrics. Make sure that those pieces are mirroring each other. Then grab one of your lining stockings and grab one of your rectangle pieces of fabric and lay them right sides together, clipping along that top edge, and then bringing it to your sewing machine and sewing a 1/2 inch seam allowance across that top edge, starting and stopping with a back stitch. Do that for both of your linings, and now it will be time to add your outer stockings. Make sure to grab the outer stocking that lines up with the lining stocking, so the toes are facing in the same direction. So I'll just lay them right sides together, and then I will pull one of the stockings down. That way I can line up that top cuff edge with the top of the outer fabric. Clip that in place, and then you will do the same thing, bringing it to your sewing machine and sewing a 1/2 inch seam allowance across that top edge, starting and stopping with the back stitch, and you will do this for both sets. Then take it to your iron and press those seams open. Next, we need to prep our loop. So grab that long, narrow piece of fabric and fold it in half, wrong sides together, just pressing a crease in place. Then fold both outer edges in towards that crease. You can press them as well. And then you can fold the entire project towards the middle and then over again. Clip along that folded edge. Take it to your sewing machine and you will sew a top stitch along both the folded edges. And now it's time to grab both of your stocking sets and lay them so that they are right sides together. Linings laying against linings and the outer fabric against the outer fabric. Start by clipping those sewn seams in place, and then you can clip around the entire project. But along that straight edge in your lining, I like to add a different pin to remind myself not to sew across that section. You will leave yourself a 4-inch space in the lining. That way you'll be able to turn your project right side out later on. And of course, continue clipping until the entire piece is clipped together. Then grab your prepped loop and fold it in half so that the raw edges are connected. And then open up your stocking so that you can tuck it in place at the top edge of your lining fabric. I like to tuck it in on a bit of an angle, and the angle is going to go up towards your cuff. So then you can clip that in place once again. Then you are going to take this to your sewing machine, and starting at that 4-inch opening, do a 1/2-inch seam allowance, starting with a back stitch, going around the entire project, and then ending again at that 4-inch opening and ending with a back stitch. Now, because we're not dealing with thick layers, all you have to do is snip a few little snips into the curves that are on the outer edge of your stocking. So before you're turning it right side out, just snip along some of these curves to give them a little bit more flexibility, and then you'll be able to turn the entire project right side out. However, if you did add a fusible fleece, let's say, to the back of your fabric, or you're using an extra thick fabric, or you're using a quilted backing on your stocking, then I actually recommend that you trim away a lot of the excess seam allowance. And then if you can still add some of those snips in and around the corners to give it that little bit of flexibility before you turn your project right side out. Once you've turned it right side out, you can use something like a chopstick to reach on inside along all of those sewn seams to help the edges be a little bit more crisp. I actually can't find my chopstick at the moment, so I just spread my fingers out and pushed the seam out that way. So you can always do that as well. Then take it to your iron and give it a nice press, making sure, of course, that 4-inch gap in the lining, you're folding those little flaps in and pressing that in place as well. Clip along that opening, and then you can bring it back to your sewing machine and sew a seam along that edge, closing that opening up nicely, starting and stopping with a back stitch, of course. And now it's time to get that lining into our outer stocking. So just pull open the toe end a little bit, and then you can reach on in. Now at this point, I actually spread all of my fingers open wide, so my hand is almost like a curve. That way I can curve the toe into the outer toe, if that makes sense. And then I'll hold that toe and pull the rest out. And once you've done that, then you can fold the cuff on over. And if you want, you can give it another press with your iron before proudly looking at your new stocking. As you can see, we only used cotton fabrics to make this stocking, so it is quite a flexible stocking. If you want your stocking to be a bit stiffer, then what you could do is add a fusible fleece to the back side of your outer cotton. That's what I did for this red stocking here, and you can tell it's much stiffer. But if you really want to level up your stocking, I have so many cool options for you. So let's jump on in to the different ways that you can use this exact same pattern and level up your stockings. Before I jump on in to the next version of a Christmas stocking, I would like to ask you guys to let me know in the comments down below which version you like best and which version you end up doing, because I love all of these versions for different reasons, and I'm probably going to admit right now this version is my favorite, which is the quilt as you go method. So we are going to jump into that one next. This one is a super easy one because it allows you to do some quilting without having to do all of the tedious, meticulous stuff that actual quilting might ask of you. So I love it, and it also is very versatile. So this stocking here is a striped version that I did using the quilt as you go method. And then this one is also a striped one, but it's just the other direction. And then of course, this is the one that I'm going to walk you through. And this is the one that I do more of an angle on. I hope that you enjoy learning the quilt as you go method. So let's jump on in and get started. Start by cutting strips of fabric around 2.5 inches wide. You can do less, you can do more. The nice thing about quilting as you go is you can even go through your scrap fabrics and use that. But if you want to create a bit of a pattern and you want all of your strips even, then do what I'm doing, which is 2.5-inch wide strips. Then lay your pattern on some quilter's batting and rough cut around your pattern. You do want your quilter's batting to be a bit larger than the pattern itself, because the quilt as you go method will shrink your batting a little bit as you add all of those extra seams. So you'll do this twice if you want to do the quilt as you go method for the front and the back of your stocking. If you want to just do the front, then just choose which side you want to do this method on, and then the back can just be a regular piece of fabric quilted onto regular quilter's cotton, however you wish. Then with a pencil or a Sharpie, or in my case, I'm going to use some chalk, I'm going to trace around the stocking itself just so that I can have a visual as I'm quilting. Start by laying one strip of fabric across your batting section, and then lay another strip of fabric right side face down on top of that. You will pin that in place and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance across one of those edges. Once you've done that, you'll take it to your iron and you'll press open those 2 strips of fabric. Now, the important thing that you need to know when you are doing this method is to make sure that your strips end up longer than the width of your batting. So as you can see here, as I flip my strip up, it's actually sticking in a little bit from the batting. You actually don't want that. You want it to be long enough that when it flips upright, it actually will cover the whole piece of batting. So make sure your strips are long, and you can always trim them off after you've flipped it up. So as you can see here, this strip, as I flip it up, it covers a lot more of the batting. If I were to do it again, I would have even moved it further over to the left. Right now, I'm just going to double check that my pattern will still work laying on top of these strips so I don't have to fix that error. And then I'm going to continue going down the line and sewing those strips in place with that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Continue doing this method all the way up to that top corner, and then you will do the same thing heading down to the toe. Make sure, of course, that your strips are long enough so that when they flip down, they are still covering that batting. Now, before moving on to one more optional step, just lay your pattern on top of your fabric to make sure that you will be able to cut it out of this little panel here, and then take it to your sewing machine. And I like to sew a 1/4 inch top stitch along the inner edge of all of those strips of fabric. Like I said, that is an optional step, but it is a step that I think really elevates the look. Next, pin your pattern in place, and then you can trim away all of the excess fabric. And this is what it will look like once you have finished. Now you can do this on the back side of your outer panel as well, or you can just do a regular quilted piece of fabric onto the back. That's totally up to you. And here are some other design styles that I did using this exact same method. And of course, you can finish your stocking the exact same way that I showed you at the beginning of this sewing tutorial. However, as you can see, I have a really nice fuzzy trim on the top edge. That needs to be done a little bit differently, and I'm going to show that to you, but not quite yet, because I do want to show you another look that you can make for your stocking first. Now, this is the most tedious of all of the methods, and it's your normal patchwork quilting. I have to admit, I love how it turns out. It's definitely worth it. So we'll jump on in. I'll walk you through the process of how I made this stocking here. Now, let me tell you, I made sure to cheat. I did the patchwork on the front. I made sure that my stocking was facing in the correct direction as far as where I'm going to be hanging them in my home. And then I just quilted another piece of fabric, and I used that for the back of my stocking because this is a bit tedious. So let's jump on in and learn how to do the patchwork method before I finally teach you how to do that cuff. With this method, you are going to use the classic quilting method. So cut a whole bunch of different strips of fabric into 2.5-inch strips, and then you will start sewing those strips together using a 1/4-inch seam allowance. Once you've sewn these strips together, then gently press open those seam allowances. Now you're not going to run your iron across the fabric because that will push and stretch the fabric. You will gently run the iron across that seam, stop and push it in place, then lift it up, move it to the next section, and stop and push it in place. That will allow your strips to stay nice and straight and not get stretched out as you're pressing all of these pieces open. Now it will depend on how many different strips you have sewn together. If this is your first time doing this method, 2 different fabrics is probably the easiest way to go. I've done 3 different fabrics. I'm going to sew my strips into sections of 4. I'm going to press them open the same way I did last time. And then it's time to bring them to your cutting board, and you will cut these chunks of fabric 2.5 inches wide once again. Then, flipping every other strip around, you will sew these sections together once again. This is how you are going to slowly create a patchwork. Then take these back to your iron and press all of those seams open once again. You are going to continue this method, sewing everything together using a 1/4-inch seam allowance until you have a large patchwork. As you can see here, I've got 3 chunks of fabric that I am just making sure I like the pattern of. Then I will sew all 3 together. I'm just going to lay my pattern on top of this right now though to make sure that it can fit. And then I will take it to my sewing machine and sew those final seams. After pressing those final seams open, then you will take your patchwork to some of your quilting batting and pin it in place. You can use quilter's pins for this, but I just used my normal pins, and I pinned all the way down all of the rows. That way my fabric is pinned so well in place that as I start the quilting process, I'm not going to be shifting the fabric around too much. I like to use a 1/4-inch sewing foot, and I sew a top stitch along the edge of all of my straight seams. I'll sew a 1/4-inch seam allowance, top stitch being 3 millimeters in length. And once I'm happy with this little mini quilt that I've created here, I will lay my pattern on top of that, pin it in place, and cut it out. And this is what that quilted patchwork will end up looking like. So you have seen a whole bunch of different versions of how to make your stocking, and now it's time to add that gorgeous fuzzy cuff. But before we do, I would like to ask you to please hit that subscribe button so you don't lose me here on YouTube. And if you're finding this tutorial helpful, please hit that thumbs up button. That lets YouTube know that this is a good video, and then YouTube will share it with others, which I greatly appreciate. So now let's jump on in to making the actual fuzzy cuff. In version 1, we created a simple cuff at the top of our Christmas stocking that was long and one piece of fabric that neatly folded over. Now, this time I want to show you how you can use a fabric called minky fabric and create a really nice fluffy cuff. I find that if you were to cut your cuff and do it the exact same way as the method I showed you at the beginning of this tutorial, your cuff will end up too thick. So what you'll need to do is cut 2 lining pieces, 9 inches wide by 6.5 inches tall, and then cut 2 of your minky fabrics, 9 inches wide and 6.5 inches tall. You'll lay them right sides together, clip along that. It's actually going to end up being the bottom edge. So if your minky lays in a particular direction, you might want to make sure that it's laying facing the edge that you're clipping, because that will be the edge that will end up face down. You'll take that to your sewing machine and you will sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance across that edge, starting and stopping with a back stitch, and you will do that with both sets. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat things. Cutting minky fabric is not fun. As you can see here, I have cut my minky to the correct size, and now I am just trying to get all that excess fluff out of the way. If you have a better method for this, please let me know in the comments down below, because I really do hate cutting minky fabric. It gets all over my cutting mat, all over my sewing room. I end up using a lint roller and I can still find fluff weeks later, but I promise you it is so worth the end result. Once you have sewn your cuffs together, then grab your outer stocking panel and lay your cuff right side on top of that, making sure that the lining is laying along the top edge of your outer stocking panel. Do this twice and then sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance along the top edge of both of those panels. You will then lay your lining stocking right side face down, matching the outer stocking. Pull it on up to that fluffy minky edge, clip it in place, and sew another 1/2 inch seam allowance across that top edge, starting and stopping with a back stitch, of course, and you will do this for both panels. Then you can finish sewing up your stocking the exact same way that I showed you in the first version of this video. And this is what your cuff will look like once you flip it on over. I love how the minky levels up the Christmas stocking. I just wish it wasn't so messy to cut and sew with. I do have more things that you can sew up for your Christmas home decor. I will have those tutorials linked in the description down below. I make a beautiful Christmas tree garland, which is super easy to make, and I have been using mine for over 8 years and I still love it the same as the first day that I created it. I also have a Christmas tree skirt and an advent calendar. So if you want some more fun sewing projects, definitely check out the description down below. And of course, let me know in the comments which Christmas stocking you end up choosing. I hope that you guys have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.